Hello and welcome back to another Star Mini Gaming YouTube video. As always, my name is James, and this is a video I've been wanting to do, honestly, since the General's Handbook 2017 first came out, and I got my hands on a copy of it. Um, I want to talk about what does the Grand Alliance of Death look like for, players of that army in the post-General's Handbook 2017 meta. This faction has clearly radically changed. I mean, the entire game really has, but perhaps none more so than Death. The armies that we ran before are no, or at least many of us ran before, no longer viable for different reasons. Whether it be that their competitive strength comparatively was weakened, whether it be the scenarios maybe don't fit the exact style that we used to play, the new six that have been introduced, or whether it's due to something along the lines of new potential combinations or ways to play the faction being buffed. It's not all negative. Or whether it's compendium units like the Tomb Kings being made into a much more insular grouping, so that their keywords were changed, their points were changed. They do not synergize well at all with the rest of Death. It used to be, for example, that you could run Necropolis Knights, Skeletal Archers, Skeleton Horse Archers, several different units that would have a Death Rattle keyword. You could run them with a bunch of regular skeletons, a White King, things like that, and they would pair quite well. And now there's still a small amount of overlap, especially with certain units like vampires, that a lot of their command abilities or unique spells specifically target death units, as opposed to like a keyword like a Death Rattle or a Mordant or something along those lines. So the overlap is not entirely gone, but it has been reduced to nearly useless. There's very, very little overlap now. So as I was saying, the Tomb Kings, they're pretty much gone now from the perspective of a newer player. Now you can still play Tomb Kings. They are still very internally synergistic. A lot of their points for their different various units were increased, so I would say their power level took a little bit of a hit. They also only have access to the Death Grand Alliance command traits and artifacts, which I'm going to touch on a little bit more in this video. I'm not going to go into those specifically. There will be follow-up videos talking more about that. But I do want to talk about, like, I guess, why I would consider that a negative aspect as opposed to them having their own unique abilities. But I'll talk about that when I get to the Death Grand Alliance as a whole. So just like I was saying, Tomb Kings, you can still play them, but they're really best now by themselves. They don't bring much synergy to the table with any other death units. There's still some, but not much. And Age of Sigmar is such a synergistic heavy game, especially in light of GHB 2017, that it lowers even further the desire to play them in a mixed force. So that being said, so let's look again at a interesting. Apologies, it's messing up on me. There we go. At a Death Grand Alliance. So what has changed in terms of playing in a Death Grand Alliance army? Well, we've had the battle trait weakened, and the command abilities have stayed mostly the same, although the slight tweaks, I would say, have been predominantly, again, weakening them. One thing that we've seen in the General's Handbook 2017, it's not just pertaining to Death, is that there has been a clear design intent in terms of command traits, artifacts, and actually a third level of customization that some of these new armies or more developed armies have available to them. And we've seen this de-incentivization of playing these large, broad armies. So, for example, we've had the Death Grand Alliance Deathless Minions trait change from the 10 inches from the first General's Handbook to now a 6-inch range, which is significant. It's almost a 50%. It's a 40% drop, which is extra significant for Death because your heroes tend to be more squishy, and things like Necromancers or a White King, it was nice to be able to keep them a little bit further back behind your front lines and let your expendable things like skeletons or zombies really tie down the enemy without your commanders necessarily having to get their hands dirty. But now that's less of an option. And with a lot of the new rules for allowing additional units on various factions to have longer than 3-inch pile-in moves, to chain attacks more like the new Iron Jaws can do. You know, basically like one attack can chain for a different unit and so on. That can potentially be dangerous for your squishier Death Alliance heroes. So that range reduction was a big deal. And then Ruler of the Night got changed to, it doubles your range to 12 inches, which is nice because it actually makes that, you know, longer than the old version of Deathless minions ever could reach. But the drawback is that you can no longer buff that 6-up, in essence, ward save to a 5-up. It's just no longer possible, period. Red Mist got changed, nerfed quite hard, in my opinion, to where you have to roll a 5-up, and on a 5 or 6, you get to attack again just as you used to, but now for really large units like a Vampire Lord on Zombie Dragon, or a Ghoul King on a Terrorgeist, or a Zombie Dragon, if you were choosing to run them within a Death Grand Alliance army as opposed to a Flesh Eater Courts army, now it's not so easy for them to basically just auto-attack twice. Now, you know, it's a 33% chance. So that's definitely a weakening of it. And then the artifacts, I would say got slightly better. I like the new version of the Cloak of Mist and Shadows, which you can use more than just once. You used to only be able to use it once. Now you have to, I believe, give up your attack. You can't attack in the combat phase, I believe it is. I don't have the book on me at this moment, but I know that you can use it more than once. The Ring of Immortality is now usable without paying reinforcement points because the model is actually not removed as a casualty and then set back up on the board. It makes the statement instead before it's removed as a casualty. You roll this to see if it regains some health. So that's a nice way to get around paying reinforcement points of 440 points to bring back a Vampire Lord on Zombie Dragon at D3 health. It's nice to not have to pay those points. So the Ring of Immortality is fixed, which is good. Cloak of Mist and Shadows is improved. A couple other tweaks here and there that are very minor. So the artifacts, I'd say, as a whole got better. Command traits got weaker, and the army-wide ability got weaker. But that's okay. Do not despair. If you're like me, you may have started out looking at this and thinking, wow, Death got kicked in the teeth again. With the removal of some of these units that really being worth bringing, like the Tomb Kings and all. But Death is just different now. We have to acknowledge that what we used to play and how we used to play is no longer competitively viable, and it's arguable whether or not it ever really was in the grand scheme of things. But Death now, and really every army, every Grand Alliance, you're going to see a lot more of the sub-factions being played. So let's start with the biggest one, which is the Flesh Eater Courts. And these guys actually have gotten even better. I won't spend too much time on them because I don't personally play them. As I've stated before, their rules are fine. I think they're an interesting army from a rules perspective. I'm just not a fan of their aesthetic at all. So that's why I don't play them. But they, a few little highlights for them is that they've gotten better as a whole because they now have this 3rd level customization that this and the other 2 unique smaller Death sub-factions have. And for them, it's these delusions. And basically there's 6 different options that you can pick from them, and it gives your army a unique ability based upon each of these 6. And one of the command traits that you can give your general is that you can change which delusion your army has during the battle, which is a nice adaptive ability. So in essence, for giving up your command trait, if you will, you get the ability to change that. So that's one I really like. They also get their own unique artifacts, which are quite powerful for the most part. I mean, obviously, like every other army, there are some that are clear winners and some that are clear losers whenever you compare them to each other. They have one in particular that gives a -2 to enemy units within 6 inches of the hero wielding it. which is nice, especially whenever you consider that in conjunction with units like Crypt Flayers and Terrorgeists, who have their Scream abilities that can inflict mortal wounds, and these tests are taken against an opponent's bravery value. So that -2 is really good. Everything else has pretty much stayed the same for them. Points didn't change much. Crypt Horrors went up, I believe, by 20. It may have been 40, but I believe it was only by 20. Regardless, the rest of the army stayed pretty much the same. They're looking pretty good moving forward. Then we come to an army that I've actually seen a lot of praise for, and I believe it's misguided. And that's the Nighthaunts. Now, let me start by saying I like the Nighthaunts army. They have a lot of units that I like the aesthetic of, in terms of I love the Mourngul. I'm not going to go again into too much detail here. I'll briefly touch on it, but I don't think the Mourngul is really playable anymore. I mean, of course, you can bring him, but he's not worth his points cost anymore. He's still at 400, but he was greatly reduced in terms of his stats. This army only has access to 3 heroes. I really say it's 2.5 because the Black Coach, I can't really count that as a hero, as I don't think it's ever worth playing. It does not have access to the army-wide ability that everybody else has of ignoring rend, which makes it the obvious softer, squishier target. The army also all have 4-up saves, again including the Black Coach. So without any way to ignore rend, the Black Coach is so much easier to hurt. 4-up is not a bad armor save by any stretch of the imagination, but when you're the one thing on the table that actually cares about rend and is a hero, and heroes are especially important in death when compared to some other armies, but especially within the Nighthaunts army, to gain access to their unique abilities, then that poor carriage that has suffered so much at the hands of the rules team will only suffer more on the tabletop. Then the other 2 heroes are, of course, the Karen Wraith and the Banshee, and these are not bad heroes in the sense that for their points, I consider them both potentially viable. The problem is that when you're running an army that contains only these heroes, you have nothing that's killy, nothing that's powerful, nothing that can take on a powerful enemy hero with a hero of your own. If they're on a monster, or if they're just a stronger combat-y hero themselves. You really have to reach for that kind of maximum hero limit at each points level, and honestly, I think for Nighthaunt that number is too low. I think that if the Nighthaunts had the ability to take, let's say, 8 heroes at a 2,000 point game, I think that would make the army slightly more viable. In addition, another problem is they literally only have 2 units to choose from. Both happen to be battle line if you take this army, so that is one nice thing. But you only have access to the Hex Wraiths and to the Spirit Hosts. Spirit Hosts are not particularly fast. They do have a nice ability to generate mortal wounds. That is a bit of a flavor of this army, is that there's a decent ability to inflict mortal wounds, but not enough to truly carry this army in any true competitive sense. Like I was saying, Spirit Hosts do not have a lot of wounds each, especially for kind of swarm unit on a base. They're rather unique in their low stats in terms of that. Their to hit is a 5-up, their to wound is a 4-up, neither of which are particularly amazing. The 4-up wound is not terrible, but the 5-up hit really puts you in a tough place. On 6s to hit, you do generate mortal wounds, so there is something nice about that. They do have a significant number of attacks each, so they're not an absolute trash unit. The problem is, again, whenever you're looking at this army, which is a very one-dimensional army, even with their unique army ability, which again I'll cover in a moment, the fact that you lack any real sense of flexibility here is a real problem. So again, they have the Hex Race as well, which are a good unit. They can fly. They're relatively fast. They're pretty sturdy in the fact that they, again, have a 4-up armor save and ignore rend. The problem is that they, like everything else in this army, cannot regenerate in any way, shape, or form, which is rather rare when you're talking about a death army. So let's go ahead and talk about the Mourngul real quick. just real high level stuff, like what were the changes and why is this piece no longer worth the 400 points in my opinion. Maybe you would still run it if you're running a Nighthaunt only list, simply because you kind of need something that's powerful, and it's at least still powerful. It's just not 400 points powerful anymore. So if you were familiar with the Morgul before, it was an absolute beast. It was fast at I believe 10-inch move. It flew. It had significant wounds. It had a good save. Again, it ignored rend, and it had a good save against mortal wounds. The changes made were its mortal wound save was reduced by 1 from a 4 up to a 5 up. So it only saves now on 5s. Its attacks used to be a -2 rend, now they're a -1 rend. It used to be if you rolled a 6 on any of the attacks, you generated an additional attack. Now, obviously, with the roll of 1, you could not generate an additional attack off of that extra attack, but it meant that you could potentially score another 2 points of damage. Now, instead, whenever you roll a 6, that attack just becomes a 3 damage attack instead of a 2 damage attack. So the difference is you had a chance to inflict 2 extra damage for every 6 that you rolled. Now you only have a chance of inflicting 1 extra damage. Yes, it's a slightly higher percentage probability wise whenever you compare the two, but I would rather have the higher ceiling, if you will, in this instance. And then the negs to hit that it generated to opponents that were nearby, it basically generated like an aura that if your bravery was, I believe, 6 or less, then you would had a -2 to all of your to hit attacks, whether or not they were targeting the Morgul. It was just it was just anyone nearby, and now it's a -1 for everybody. It used to be if you had I believe a 7 or more. I may be off slightly on the bravery, but it used to be if your bravery was okay, then you were a -1 to hit, and if your bravery was pretty bad, you were a -2 to hit. And now it's just a -1 across the board. So those are the 4 big changes. I wouldn't have had a huge problem with that had the Morgul's points been reduced to maybe something in the neighborhood of 340. At 400 points, I already struggled to justify bringing him locally because we already had a bit of a horde type meta, and all indications based upon the new scenarios, the way that we have these kind of large unit discounts whenever you max them out. In terms of the maximum amount that you can take, you get a discount on that final unit that or final what's the way that I guess the final add-on that you're buying, right? So if you're buying skeletons, for example, you max out at 40, you buy them by 10s. So the final 10 that you buy, going from 30 skeletons in the unit to 40, are discounted to half of their 80 points, so they only cost you 40. So all indications are that we're reaching more of a horde type way of playing, at least that being the most advantageous way to play. And the Morgul at 400 points with its offense reduced doesn't mathematically make sense in that. But again, because the Nighthaunts are so limited in terms of the amount of power that they can put out per unit, and they have no regen ability, so not really as much long staying power against a large number of attacks. Something like the Morgul still might find a place in a Nighthaunt pure army. So now that we've covered a lot of the unit weaknesses, I would like to touch on what the army's unique abilities are and why I think that people get overhyped about this army. And I did want to start by kind of framing this because these abilities do look really, really good, unless you consider the units that are within the army and how they are truly the limiting factor for this ability. So the Nighthaunts basically have the Stormcast Eternals army-wide deep strike ability. The difference is that this ability is only able to be used so long as you have a Nighthaunts hero on the table, and that's a good ability. Like let's just be honest, that's powerful. Any kind of teleportation, deep strike, movement shenanigans that you can bring onto the table to move around quickly is a good thing. The problem here being that, let's say that you bring 4 heroes and you only start with 2 on the table because you would like the other 2 to be able to deep strike in with the rest of your army and confer the 6-up save. I should have mentioned it earlier, but obviously I overlooked it. Each of these death sub-faction armies have the same battle trait as the Death Grand Alliance, except for it only applies that 6-up ward save to units that have the faction-specific keyword. So for Flesh Eater Courts, it's anyone with the Flesh Eater Courts keyword. For Nighthaunts, it's anyone with the Nighthaunts keyword. For Soulblight, again, anyone with the Soulblight's keyword. So, you might want to save 2 heroes to drop with your army to confer that second level of save against Mortal Wounds, because Mortal Wounds, as much as this army can kick out a few themselves, are really the bane of this army. That and massive attacks against them. So, so if you keep a couple in reserve and you only bring 2, maybe 3 on the table initially, and maybe you don't get turned 1 because you're still not a super low drop army in terms of your entire army, and there's certainly armies that can drop as a 1 drop or 2 drop. You run the risk of being shot off the table before your units can even come in. And then there's also the chance that your unit fails to arrive because you have to roll for each unit to see if it comes onto the table. And then even once they get on the table, you face the problem of, other than the Hex Wraiths and of course the Mourngul, it's not a particularly fast army. Yes, Cairn Wraiths and everything else in it can fly, except for, of course, the Black Coach, unless you buff it up, but we're not even going to touch on that because, frankly, the Black Coach is not worth its points, nor being included within this army. But other than those 2 units, once they're on the table, they are not particularly quick. There's no way to put them back into reserves and then, in essence, deep strike them again, or any other kind of movement shenanigans like that. So once you're on the table, you're pretty much where you're going to be. You're going to trudge slowly around the rest of the battlefield to try to catch up to your enemy's units to contest various points or do whatever it is that the scenario calls for. So if you choose to keep units in reserve to negate that fact that you're a little bit slower army once you're on the table, and you're unable to react as quickly as you might like, then again you run the risk of those units never coming in at all. Additionally, this army lacks any wizards of their own. You do have an ability to kind of get around that with one of the command traits that you can take, but that's just 1 unit that can potentially be it, and you're in essence giving up your command trait, which there are some pretty decent ones, including one that adds a wound to your profile, which is good whenever your heroes are all 4 wounds each. You particularly need something to increase their survivability. Their allies as well, because within the new match play system, you have the option of basically remaining faction pure, if you will, and taking up to 20% of your army's total point value in allies. And of course, these allies do not gain access to the command trait that your army has because they don't have the correct keyword, and they are limited within each subfaction. If you look in the General's Handbook, with each subfaction, it gives a list of other subfactions that they can ally with directly, and Nighthaunts is one of the more limited ones within Death. For example, they cannot ally with Death Rattle, which is a big problem because a lot of these scenarios require that you have large masses of units within single squads to kind of serve as a tiebreaker in certain scenarios, and the magic number is 20 here. Whenever there's a tiebreaker that has that kind of thing, 20 is the magic number, and the only unit within this army that can reach that is Hex Wraiths at exactly 20. So if you lose 1 model, all of a sudden you lose the ability to reach this tiebreaker, and not being able to bring in Death Rattle removes in my opinion, the best unit available to Death to reach massive numbers and have some level of survivability in that squad. So that's a problem. And yeah, just again, they suffer from the hero caps, and these heroes are not particularly strong. So if you bring the maximum of 6 in a 2,000 point game, you are bringing only 24 wounds of heroes as your absolute most upper limit that you can achieve, which is insignificant when compared to what the other Death subfactions can do. So now we come to the real hero, I think, and the army that I will be running the most of, and the one that outside of maybe Flesh Eater Courts and maybe beyond Flesh Eater Courts, honestly, with how promising they look, we have the Soulblight. Now, Soulblight is an army that I didn't expect to get much of a buff, but I'm super excited for. I love the Soulblight models. The vampire models have been my favorite in Death. I don't think I've run a Death army that actually, I was going to say above 1,000 points, but I don't think I've run a Death army, period, since purchasing any of the Soulblight models. I don't think I've run a Death army that didn't contain at least one, especially a commander, because their commanders are excellent, have been excellent, and have gotten even better. So I believe that this is the sub-faction within Death that can thrive the most. Now, why is that? Because their unique abilities, their kind of third level customization, is what's called bloodlines here, and they have four different options, and they're all pretty good. You have access to one that gives you +1 to hit on the charge. I'm sorry, not +1. It's I believe it's re-rolling ones. I honestly can't remember. It's a bonus to when you charge. It's either a +1 to hit or a re-rolling of 1. I should have had the book with me. Again, I apologize for that. But then there's an additional one that basically gives your Soulblight army the benefit of always counting as being within range of a hero, regardless of whether or not there's a hero on the table, to get your 6-up ward save. So suddenly your entire army has a 2nd level of save, regardless of whether a hero is babysitting them or not, which is not a bad ability. And then there's another one, which is one of my personal favorites, that gives you a +1 on all casting and unbinding rolls for your heroes. Obviously, they're wizards, which all the heroes within Soulblight are. And in addition, all enemy units that are within 6 inches of a Soulblight unit that has this bloodline ability suffer a -1 to their bravery in the in the combat phase. So whenever you're testing to see if you lose any units due to battle shock, the battle shock phase. And then my personal favorite is the one that's called Swift Death. And it is somewhat redundant within the army, but is a +2 movement to your entire Soulblight army, and all of your units with the Soulblight keyword gain the flying ability. Now, the only units that this can even potentially apply to are your Blood Knights and your Vampire Lord, not mounted, if you choose to take it either on horseback or on foot. You could alternatively have given it the wings to begin with and given it the fly ability. So really the only unit that didn't have access to this at all was the Blood Knights. But now suddenly your entire army is 2 inches faster, which is quite significant because every unit within this army is very fast. And on top of that, you're giving your Blood Knights fly. Like, let's not underestimate the power of the ability to just hide behind terrain and leap over it to pick your fights, or to leap over enemy chaff units or units that are attempting to be a speed bump to your force, to be able to jump over your opponent's front lines and hit their back line, hit their spellcasters, hit their heroes, whatever it might be, jump over them, take objectives. There's so many different really strong positives that fly brings to the table. So it's a very, very worthy ability to have. In addition, you have good command traits and artifacts. Personally, my favorite is the command trait known as Mist Form, which allows your general to choose to retreat out of combat as though it can fly, which again, there's only one particular unit that this would give fly to, otherwise that particular part of the ability is redundant. But it also allows you to charge into combat and fight again as well, even though you've retreated, which is incredibly powerful because if you recall within Age of Sigmar, whenever you retreat, you do not have to retreat backwards. So towards your own line, you just have to retreat away from the combat. And so you can actually leapfrog over the unit that you were just fighting, since your entire army can fly if you're taking Swift Death, and move further down the table towards their back line or whatever. So literally there's no way to hold you up unless they can surround you so much that your increased speed does not allow for you to move away from combat somewhere. which is doable, just difficult for them. And just the fact is that this is an incredible ability for both offensive and defensive purposes. If you're in trouble, you retreat out, then you go smash something else. And if you want to use it purely for offensive abilities, you can continue to pick your fights. Or if you're bringing a Vampire Lord on Zombie Dragon, you want to be in the same combat you're already in, well, then just retreat out and then charge right back in again and smash them with your lance, gaining the benefit of having charged every single turn. So this is a very good ability that I don't think is ever not useful. And then in terms of the artifacts, there's it has a longer title. I just call it the Sanguine Banner. If you look at the list of artifacts, you can't miss it. It's something like the banner of the Sanguine Throne, or something of that effect. And what this does is it allows one of your vampiric units, so any unit with the vampire keyword, once per turn within 12 inches of the unit holding this banner. So yes, the unit that holds it is within 12 of itself, to reroll a charge, which is good because you're just taking all these other abilities that have already made this army that's already quite fast, even faster. So flying and the +2 to their movement, and now you're re-rolling a failed charge. So you're just taking that speed up even higher. And then the other one is the Ruby Vial, which pairs really well with the Bloodline that gives the -1 to enemy bravery in the Battle Shock phase, because it's a single-time use for the entire turn. All of your enemy's army suffers a -1 to their bravery. So that pairs quite well, obviously, with that, because then they're at a -2 during the Battle Shock phase. So if you've hit any unit particularly hard, they're probably going to lose a lot to Battle Shock as well. Or if you've allied in or summoned in something like a Terrorgeist, and then that obviously pairs quite well with their Scream, and that's a battlefield-wide ability. And then really every unit within this army has a pretty significant role to play, even units like the Fell Bats and the Bat Swarms. I know the Bat Swarms were used some before to kind of serve as a deterrent to enemy shooting, because it gave a negative modifier to your opponent. The Fell Bats now have what I call the Bat Bomb ability, where you basically will be running them as an escort to your Blood Knights or your Vargeist, which are your 2 battle line choices. And you'll just run these bats in a kamikaze type raid, where their sole goal is to kill as much of the enemies as they can and then die. It doesn't really matter. Or to just leapfrog enemies, because with their +2-inch movement, if you're taking Swift Death, they're at a 16-inch movement, and obviously they're flying. So they're just ignoring stuff and going right into the back lines if your opponent has a siege weapon or something that's a more squishy target that they can deal with. They definitely have their versatility. But again, I will cover more specifically how to play Soulblight in terms of list to run, combos to use, and deep diving a bit more in a further video. I just wanted to touch on them because honestly, they are what excites me about Death going forward. I do think Death is in a decent position. I think that Soulblight and Flesh Eater Courts will represent us quite well. I do think that in certain builds, in certain instances, a Grand Alliance Death army is viable, but we're going to have to look at it differently than we did before. And again, I will touch on that more in another video. I just wanted to do kind of a high-level summary of where is Death now and why we shouldn't necessarily be too worried about the future moving forward. So with all that being said, I'm going to wrap it up here. This has been James, and until next time, happy gaming.